The cold rain did not just soak Lily, it felt like it was drilling directly into her bones. When her stepmother, Eleanor, shoved her out of the heavy front door of the country house, the sound of the metal bolt clicking into place was louder than the thunder overhead. Lily stood on the wet gravel with nothing but a pair of torn shoes, a thin wrap over her shoulders, and 3 miles of empty, dark country road ahead of her. The house behind her had always smelled of wood smoke and dried flowers, but out here in the storm, there was only the sharp smell of wet earth and the freezing wind. Eleanor had not screamed or thrown things when she kicked her out, which made it much worse. She had simply stood in the hallway with her arms crossed tightly, her breath forming small white clouds in the damp air, looking completely indifferent. Eleanor had told her that the bill collectors were coming on Tuesday, noting that there were only 3 beds left in the house, and her own daughters needed them. She called Lily a waste of food and wood, telling her to go find her mother's family in the next town. When Lily whispered that those people were all dead, Eleanor simply replied that they would not mind the company, and then she shut the door. Lily did not cry because crying took energy, and her stomach was completely empty after eating only a small piece of dry bread the day before. Her body was already freezing, turning numb as it tried to keep her core warm while she walked away from the only home she had ever known. The rain turned into heavy, stinging ice that blurred her vision and tangled her hair around her face until it felt like wet ropes. Her boots, which had belonged to her father, and were stuffed with old paper at the toes to stay on her feet, sank deeply into the thick mud of the driveway with every single step. She did not look back at the gray stone walls of the estate because they were already disappearing into the dark evening fog. She kept her head down, tucking her chin into her wet wrap to protect her neck from the biting wind, forcing herself to move. She kept telling her feet to lift and push through the heavy mud, focusing entirely on the physical effort of moving forward. The main road was even worse than the driveway because heavy farm wagons had carved deep ruts that were now filled with freezing water. The mud here was thick and sticky, pulling at her loose boots and making her leg muscles burn with exhaustion. Her hands were shoved deep into her pockets. But she lost all feeling in them within 20 minutes, passing from a sharp stinging pain to total numbness. Suddenly, her toe hit a rock hidden beneath the water, and she fell forward into a deep puddle. The freezing water splashed over her face and mouth, and the sharp gravel scraped the skin off her palms. She stayed there on her hands and knees in the dark road, listening to the rain beat against her back, fully believing she was going to die. It was a simple, miserable reality. She was going to freeze in a ditch because a greedy widow did not want to share her food. She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook wildly and failed her, leaving her tempted to just lay her head down in the mud and close her eyes. Then the ground began to shake beneath her bleeding hands, starting as a low vibration before turning into the heavy sound of galloping horses. She heard the sharp jangle of metal harnesses and the loud crunch of wooden wheels tearing through the wet gravel behind her. Lily did not really care about being saved, but a basic animal instinct made her scramble backward into the brush to avoid being crushed. A massive black carriage surged out of the dark fog, pulled by 6 huge dark horses that were running far too fast for the storm. White steam poured from the horses' noses as they tore down the road, their black coats dripping with sweat and rain. The driver, a large man wrapped in a heavy waterproof coat, saw Lily at the very last second and pulled back hard on the leather reins. The horses let out a sharp cry, rearing up into the air as the heavy carriage slid sideways through the mud. It came to a sudden, violent stop just a few feet from where Lily was crouching in the wet weeds. The area became completely quiet, except for the heavy breathing of the tired horses and the sound of the rain hitting the carriage roof. Lily coughed, wiping the dirty water and mud from her lips with a shaking hand, her jaw freezing so tightly that she could barely move it. Up on the driver's seat, the man was struggling with the metal brake lever, trying to calm the frightened animals. He leaned over the side, peering into the dark fog, and yelled at Lily, asking what she was doing in the middle of the road during a storm. Lily tried to answer him, but her teeth were chattering so hard that she accidentally bit her tongue, filling her mouth with the taste of blood. Before the driver could shout another insult, the heavy carriage door swung open, and a long boot stepped down onto the metal step. A man descended from the vehicle into the deep mud, moving with a slow, calm annoyance rather than any sense of hurry. The man wore a long, dark wool coat left open to reveal a gray vest and a heavy silver chain across his front. He did not wear a hat, and the freezing rain immediately soaked his hair, which was completely brilliantly white. His skin was just as white as his hair, looking like smooth, polished stone in the dark evening light. He did not look at Lily with any kindness or pity. He simply stared at her as if she were an annoying problem blocking his path. He let out a long, slow breath that did not create a cloud of vapor in the cold air, keeping his dark eyes fixed on her. He asked the driver if she was dead, speaking in a low, deep voice that carried clearly over the sound of the wind. The driver shouted back that she was alive, claiming she had crawled right in front of the horses on purpose. The white-haired man reached into his pocket, pulled out a pair of fine leather gloves, and slowly pulled them onto his hands, adjusting each finger. He looked down at Lily again and asked her if she was able to stand up on her own. Lily stared back at him, feeling a sudden flash of anger because he was standing there completely calm while she was freezing to death in the mud. That anger gave her a small burst of warmth, allowing her to force her body to move despite the pain. She told him she could stand, though her voice sounded like rough stones rubbing together as she pushed herself off the ground. Her legs shook violently, and the world spun in dark spots, forcing her to lean heavily against the muddy carriage wheel to keep from falling. The white-haired man watched her closely, but made absolutely no move to help her, studying her torn clothes and her bloody face. He asked her where she was going, and Lily lied, telling him she was heading toward the town. The man replied flatly that the town was 14 miles away, and she would freeze to death before she walked to. Lily snapped back that she would die quietly then, so she could stop delaying his important journey. The white-haired man blinked, and the corner of his lip moved just a fraction, though he did not actually smile. He looked at the mud dripping from her dress, then up at the dark sky, and finally back at the warm inside of his carriage. He seemed to make a quick decision in his mind before telling her to get into the vehicle. Lily immediately said no, but the man let out a sharp, impatient breath. He told her he was not trying to save her soul, but was simply keeping a dead body from blocking his road, ordering her into the carriage before he turned around and climbed back inside. The inside of the carriage was an incredible shock to Lily's frozen body, smelling intensely of clean leather and expensive wood smoke. A metal foot warmer beneath the seat radiated a deep physical heat that made the air inside feel thick and heavy compared to the freezing wind. Lily hesitated on the iron step because her clothes were completely covered in wet mud, while the seats were covered in clean red velvet. The white-haired man told her to either get in or stay outside to freeze, complaining that she was letting the cold, damp air into his cabin. Lily bit her lip, gripped the metal handle, and pulled her heavy body up into the carriage, collapsing onto the bench opposite him. She sat on the very edge of the seat, holding her arms tightly against her chest to keep her dirty skirt from touching the nice fabric. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving them in near darkness except for the small lanterns outside that cast a faint glow through the wet glass. The carriage moved forward with a sudden jerk as the driver cracked his whip, throwing Lily back against the seat cushions and hurting her sore ribs. The white-haired man sat completely still across from her, his long legs crossed as he watched her with total detachment. He mentioned calmly that she was ruining his clean seats, but Lily retorted that she had tried to stay in the ditch where he found her. Her teeth were still clicking together so hard that her words sounded broken, and the sudden heat of the cabin was starting to cause her real pain. Her frozen skin began to burn and itch as the blood forced its way back into her hands and feet, making her feel miserable. She wiped her wet face with the back of her wrist, too tired to care about her appearance, but still too stubborn to show any weakness. The man reached beside him, picked up a heavy, dark wool blanket, and threw it across the small space onto her lap. He ordered her to wrap herself up, stating that if she died of sickness in his carriage, it would create too much legal paperwork for him to handle. Lily looked at the dry blanket, wanting to throw it back at his pale face, but her hands moved on their own, pulling the warm wool over her shoulders. She buried her face in the edge of the blanket, which smelled like rain, and the strange, clean scent of the man sitting opposite her. She huddled into a small ball under the weight of the wool, her body shaking hard as the warmth began to sink in. The white-haired man asked her who had thrown her out of her house in the middle of a storm. Lily stiffened under the blanket and lied again, saying she had simply gone out for a walk without her hat while wearing boots that were too big. The man leaned his white head back against the velvet seat, his dark eyes half closed as he told her she was a terrible liar. Lily told him she did not remember asking for his opinion on her personality, but he replied that since she was dripping water on his boots, he was allowed to talk. He shifted his position, his leather boots creaking softly in the quiet space, and asked if it was a husband who had kicked her out. Lily told him she was not married, and when he asked if her father had done it, she told him her father was dead. The man opened his eyes fully, studying her pale face in the dim lantern light while Lily stared back, hating the way he inspected her. He looked at her the way a worker looks at a broken wheel on a wagon, trying to see if it can be fixed, or if it should be thrown away. She finally admitted that her stepmother had done it, because the family estate was ruined and she wanted Lily's bedroom for her own daughters. When Lily told him her stepmother had sent her to find her mother's family and that they were all in the graveyard, the white-haired man went completely silent. The carriage swayed heavily as it hit another hole in the road, causing the metal foot warmer to slide against the floorboards. The man stated flatly that she had nowhere to go, and Lily pulled the blanket tighter around her neck, feeling a bit sick from the sudden heat. She told him she would find work washing dishes in a kitchen or a tavern, insisting that she did not want his pity. The man assured her that he had no pity to give her, reaching into his heavy coat to pull out a silver flask. He unscrewed the top and held it out to her, telling her to drink it. Lily stared at the silver metal, asking what it was, and the man replied dryly that it was poison to stop her teeth from making noise, though he admitted it was actually brandy. Lily hesitated for a second before reaching out to take the flask, her hand shaking so much that she almost dropped the metal container. The man's gloved hand moved quickly, his fingers brushing against hers to steady the flask, and Lily noticed that his grip was surprisingly firm and warm despite his icy look. She pulled the flask away from him, lifted it to her lips, and took a large swallow of the strong liquor. The alcohol burned a hot path down her throat and hit her empty stomach like fire, causing her to cough until her eyes watered. However, a real sense of warmth immediately began to spread through her chest, making her feel much stronger. She handed the silver flask back to him, muttering a quick thank you, even though she hated showing any gratitude to such a cold person. The man took the flask, wiped the top with his thumb, took a small sip himself, and slid it back into his coat pocket. He told her they were traveling toward Boston and would stop at an inn in 4 hours to let the horses rest in the stables. He said she could stay inside the warm carriage until they arrived, but after that stop, she would no longer be his problem. Lily agreed quickly, closing her eyes and letting her head rest against the moving wall of the carriage, glad to know she was safe for at least 4 hours. She was in a carriage with a strange white-haired man, whose name she did not even know, ruining his floor with mud and completely alone in the world. Yet, she had never felt more relieved in her entire life as the exhaustion finally pulled her down into a deep, heavy sleep. Across from her, the white-haired man watched the steady movement of her chest as she slept, looking down at the mud around his boots. He had expected a crying girl when he stopped the carriage, but he had found something much sharper, and he wondered which was more dangerous to his peace. The carriage wheel hit a large rock in the road, throwing Lily sideways against the hard wooden wall of the cabin and waking her up with a sharp gasp. Her neck hurt from the sudden movement, and the heavy wool blanket had slipped down to the floor into the puddle of dirty water she had brought in. For a few seconds, she did not know where she was, breathing in the thick scent of leather and tobacco in the dark space. The white-haired man spoke from the shadows, telling her they had arrived at the inn while he fastened the metal buttons of his heavy coat. He had not slept at all during the long drive, his pale eyes looking out the wet glass window into the courtyard. Lily tried to sit up straight, but her body felt completely broken now that the temporary warmth of the cabin had faded away. Her joints felt stiff and painful, and the cuts on her hands throbbed with a sharp heat every time she moved her fingers. When she moved her mouth, the cut on her lip tore open again, giving her that familiar coppery taste of blood. Outside, the heavy rain had stopped, leaving a thick, miserable drizzle that hung low over the courtyard of a large wooden inn. The wooden sign swinging in the wind read the Green Dragon, and the air coming through the door smelled of wood smoke, roast meat, and horses. Lily's stomach hurt so badly from hunger that she had to wrap her arms around her middle, the smell of food acting like torture. The carriage door was pulled open from the outside by a wet stable boy, who quickly dropped the iron step for them. The white-haired man climbed down into the mud first without offering Lily any help, tossing a small coin to the young boy. He turned his white head slightly, looking back into the dark carriage, and reminded her that their agreement was for 4 hours only. He told her they were in a small crossroads town, and the main road to Boston continued south, wishing her a good evening, before walking toward the bright windows of the tavern. Lily sat on the velvet bench for several seconds, her pride telling her to stay inside until he was gone so she could slip away into the dark yard. But the smell of the hot meat drifted into the carriage again, overriding her thoughts and forcing her to move. She grabbed the wet wool blanket from the floor, not caring that it belonged to him, and wrapped it around her shoulders before climbing down into the drizzle. Her legs almost gave out when her boots hit the slippery mud, forcing her to lean against the wheel to find her balance. She focused entirely on the heavy wooden door of the inn, forcing her feet to move forward one after the other through the muck. When she pushed open the heavy door, the loud noise and the intense heat of the crowded room hit her like a physical blow. The main room was filled with local farmers, travelers, and guards who were all drinking and trying to stay dry after the terrible storm. The air was thick with gray pipe smoke, and the sour smell of spilled beer, and the loud talking stopped completely the moment Lily entered. She knew exactly what she looked like to them. Her hair was a wild, wet mess, and her face was covered in dried blood and dark mud. She was wearing huge men's boots and holding an expensive blanket over a ruined dress, looking like a beggar who had lost her way. Across the room, the white-haired man was standing at the wooden bar, speaking quietly to the large innkeeper who wore a dirty apron. The innkeeper looked past the man's shoulder, his eyes widening in disgust when he saw Lily standing by the door dripping water onto his floor. The large innkeeper pointed a thick finger at her, shouting that he did not allow beggars in his tavern and telling her to go to the stables if she had money for straw. Lily stiffened, gripping the wool blanket tighter as she prepared to turn around and walk back out into the cold night. She was determined not to let them throw her out of 2 places in one night, preferring to leave on her own 2 feet. But the white-haired man spoke up without raising his voice, his deep words carrying a clear sense of authority that made the innkeeper stop talking immediately. He turned around slowly to look at Lily standing in her puddle of dirty water, a small muscle moving in his jaw as the only sign of his anger. He turned back to the bar and placed 2 large gold coins onto the wood, an incredible amount of money for a simple roadside inn. He ordered a private room, a basin of boiling water, and a plate of the hot meat from the fire, demanding that everything be brought upstairs immediately. He tapped his gloved finger against the gold coins, telling the innkeeper that the girl was not to be spoken to or disturbed by anyone in the house. The innkeeper stared at the gold, swallowing hard before nodding quickly and promising to take care of everything right away. The white-haired man did not look at Lily again as he walked past her toward the wooden staircase, telling her over his shoulder to follow the maid and not to ruin the bedsheets. Lily stood frozen in place, hating him completely in that moment for his wealth and his cold power, knowing he was right to treat her like a stray animal. But her stomach hurt terribly from hunger, so she lowered her eyes and followed the frightened young maid up the creaking wooden steps. The small room upstairs felt cold and smelled of old wax, reminding Lily of the hallway she had been kicked out of just hours before. She stood in the center of the small rug until the maid left the room and shut the door tightly behind her. Only then did Lily let the heavy wool blanket fall from her shoulders, the wet fabric hitting the wood with a dull thud. Her fingers were shaking so much that she could barely open the small buttons on her wet dress, which clung to her skin like ice. She peeled the wet garment off, shivering as the cold wind from the poorly sealed window hit her bare arms in the quiet space. She stood there in her damp undergarments, her breath coming in short gasps as she looked at the water pitcher on the small table. Steam was rising from the hot water, and a piece of rough soap and a clean towel lay right beside the basin. Lily poured the hot water into the bowl, the sound loud in the quiet room, and plunged her cold hands straight into the liquid. The intense heat hurt her frozen fingers like a physical blow, causing her to pull them out quickly with a soft cry. The skin on her hands turned bright red, and the small cuts on her palms began to bleed slightly from the rough washing. She forced herself to wait a moment, breathing deeply through her nose before dipping the cloth into the water and rubbing it against the soap. She washed herself quickly and roughly, scrubbing the dark mud from her face and flinching when the cloth touched her torn lip. She cleaned her neck and arms, trying to remove every trace of the road until the water in the bowl turned dark brown. She was just trying to wring the water out of her wet hair when a sharp knock sounded on the wooden door. Lily froze in place, asking who was there in a rough, painful voice that felt like sand in her throat. A deep voice ordered her to open the door, and Lily looked down at her thin, wet clothing, telling him she was not dressed. The voice replied that he had seen a person's shoulder before, telling her to open the door before he broke it off the hinges because he had no patience left. Lily bit her lip, wrapped the rough towel over her shoulders, and walked to the door to unlock it, opening it just enough to see out. The white-haired man stood in the dark hallway without his heavy coat, his shirt slightly loosened, so he looked more like a tired man than a statue. In his hands, he held a small green bottle and a bundle of rough brown clothes, holding them out toward her without trying to enter. He told her the bottle contained a medicine made from tree bark, instructing her to drink half of it to bring her fever down despite its terrible taste. He added that the clothes belonged to one of the kitchen maids, noting they would be too large for her but were at least dry. Lily stared at the green bottle and the clothes, making no move to take them, as she asked him why he was helping her. The man leaned against the wooden doorframe, studying her closely in the dim light of the hallway. He looked at her wet hair, the dark shadows under her eyes, and the defensive way she held the towel across her chest. He told her he was not doing it out of kindness, explaining that she was running a dangerous fever that he could hear from downstairs. He said if she died in the inn, the local sheriff would delay his journey to ask endless questions, so she needed to take the bottle. Lily snatched the items from his hands, the glass bottle feeling cold against her skin, while the brown cloth felt rough but wonderfully dry. She lifted her chin, asking if the hot food he ordered was also meant to prevent a sheriff from asking him questions. The white-haired man replied that the food was simply meant to stop her stomach from making noise because the sound was irritating his ears. He stepped away from the door, telling her to eat, drink the medicine, and be gone before he woke up at dawn to continue his trip. Lily told him to wait, the words feeling heavy in her mouth, but she forced them out because she knew she had to say them. The man stopped and looked back over his shoulder, his expression careful as if he expected her to beg for money or cry. She told him thank you, speaking in a stiff, careful voice that showed how much she hated needing his help. The white-haired man stared at her for a second, a tiny smile touching his pale lips, as he remarked that she was very bad at showing gratitude before walking away. The smell of hot coffee and fresh bread woke Lily from her deep sleep as the gray morning light came through the dirty window. Her body felt incredibly sore, every single muscle hurting, as she forced herself to sit up on the edge of the small bed. Her mouth tasted terrible from the bitter medicine she had taken, but her forehead felt cool to the touch, meaning the fever was gone. She looked down at the kitchen maid's brown dress, which was much too large for her small frame but felt clean and dry. She pulled a wooden comb through her tangled hair, tying it back with a piece of ribbon she found in her old pocket. She shoved her bare feet back into her father's stiff, cold leather boots, which were still sitting in a small puddle by the door. She walked over to the window and looked down into the muddy yard of the inn, where the sun was just beginning to rise. The storm had passed completely, leaving a cold gray sky over the courtyard, where the big black carriage was being prepared for the road. The 6 dark horses were stamping their feet against the stones, their breath forming white clouds in the freezing morning air. The white-haired man was standing near the back of the carriage, holding a gold pocket watch in his gloved hand. His clothes looked perfectly clean and brushed, showing absolutely no sign of the terrible weather they had driven through the night before. He was talking to his driver, pointing a long finger toward the southern road that led toward the big city. Lily felt her heart beat wildly against her ribs because she knew she had absolutely nothing left in the world. She had no money, no friends, and if she stayed at this inn, the owner would make her scrub pots forever to pay for her room. She remembered Eleanor's cold voice telling her she was a waste of food and she knew she could not stay in this small town. She turned away from the window, walked out of the room, and marched down the narrow wooden steps into the main room of the inn. She ignored the looks of the people eating their breakfast, pushing open the heavy door to step out into the freezing morning air. She walked straight across the wet mud of the yard, heading directly toward the white-haired man before the driver could stop her. The driver moved to block her path, but the white-haired man ordered him to stand aside without looking up from his watch. He snapped the silver lid shut, placed it into his vest, and finally looked at Lily standing before him in her oversized brown dress. He told her he remembered saying their business was finished, warning her that if she was there to beg for money, the answer was no. Lily stood tall, refusing to let her shoulders drop in the cold wind, and told him she did not want his money. She said she wanted a seat in his carriage all the way to Boston, causing the white-haired man to let out a short, cold laugh. He told her she must be crazy from the fever because he was not running a public stagecoach for travelers. Lily replied that she knew exactly what he was doing, explaining that she was offering him a fair trade instead of asking for help. The man crossed his arms over his chest, looking at her with a look of slight curiosity as he asked what she could possibly offer him. He pointed out that she was wearing a sack for a dress, giant boots, and had a broken lip, asking what a powerful man like him could need from her. Lily looked him right in the eyes and said she was offering him her total silence and discretion about his journey. The white-haired man narrowed his dark eyes, his casual attitude disappearing completely as he told her to explain what she meant. Lily stepped closer, smelling the clean wood scent of his coat, and pointed out that he was traveling through a storm in a plain carriage with no family markers. She noted that he had no servants with him except for a single driver, meaning he was traveling in secret and was in a terrible hurry. She told him that anyone from his own wealthy class would ask endless questions, want to stop for tea, and talk to everyone about his business. She insisted that she did not care why he was rushing to Boston or who he was running from, promising to sit in the corner and remain completely silent the entire way. She added that she was highly useful because she had managed all the financial books for her father's estate for 5 years before it failed. She told him she could read maps, write letters in 3 different languages, and would not require a single stop until they reached the city. The white-haired man studied her face carefully, looking for any sign of fear or deceit, but he found only a strong will to survive. He stated that she was asking to be an unpaid worker in exchange for a ride, and Lily corrected him, saying she was simply paying her fare. He looked down the empty southern road for a long moment, the wind blowing his white hair around his pale face. He was a man who liked things to be useful, and he saw that this girl had a sharp mind that could be helpful to him. He turned back to her, his pale eyes hard as he warned her that if she complained, cried, or made a mess in his carriage, he would throw her out while it was moving. Lily did not move or show any fear, telling him they had a perfect understanding before he ordered the driver to open the door and let her in. The long drive to Boston was a terrible test of strength, filled with hours of complete and heavy silence between the 2 travelers. For the first 6 hours, neither of them said a single word as the carriage bounced violently over the ruined dirt roads. Lily sat completely still on her bench, keeping her large boots tucked under her skirt so she would not get any dirt on the nice seats. She stared out the wet window glass, watching the gray trees and empty fields move past in the cold rain. Her back hurt from the constant movement, and the rough brown dress scratched her skin until it was red, but she refused to complain. She breathed quietly through her nose, focusing entirely on keeping her body steady against the rough movement of the carriage. Across the small space, the white-haired man was working intensely, having pulled a large leather folder of papers from a box under his seat. For hours, he wrote notes onto thick paper, with a silver pen, his white brow pulled down in a look of deep anger. Sometimes he would mutter darkly to himself, crossing out whole lines of text with thick black ink, because something was wrong. Suddenly, the carriage hit a massive hole in the road, tilting the entire cabin sideways and causing his silver pen to slip across the page. A large drop of black ink splattered onto his clean gray trousers, causing him to stop moving completely as he stared at the stain. The air inside the carriage suddenly felt incredibly cold and heavy, as if the wind from the storm had somehow come inside. He carefully put the pen away, pressed his pale hands against his eyes, and let out a long, cold breath that sounded like grinding metal. He muttered a word in French, his voice rough and angry, causing Lily to turn her head away from the window to look at him. He dropped his hands, picked up a wet, crumpled letter from his pile, and shoved it across the small space into her lap. He told her she claimed to read 3 languages, demanding to know if she could read the messy French writing on the paper. Lily looked at the thick paper, her fingers brushing against his leather glove as she picked it up to read. The writing was terrible, the ink smeared and the letters small and slanted across the page. Lily leaned closer to the window light, her eyes moving quickly over the words as she looked for the legal phrases her father had taught her. The white-haired man watched her closely, noting that the swelling on her lip had gone down, leaving only a small dark mark on her skin. She looked up from the paper, meeting his hard eyes, and told him the writer was not talking about a simple shipping tax. The man sat forward, his leather boots creaking in the quiet cabin, and demanded to know what the letter actually said. Lily explained that it was an official notice from the harbor master in France, stating that his expensive silk cargo had been seized by the government. She told him the officials believed his shipping papers were fake, and his agent was asking for 400 francs immediately to fix the problem before the judge arrived. The white-haired man went completely still, his pale skin looking like carved stone as the color drained from his face. He ordered her to read it again, but Lily handed the paper back, telling him she did not need to because the words were very clear. She pointed out the specific words regarding the fake government seals, and the man snatched the paper back, his jaw clenching tightly in silent anger. He did not shout or throw the papers, but the cold stillness that came over him was far more frightening than any loud scream. He whispered to himself about his brother, calling him a stupid, greedy thief who had ruined his business before looking back up at Lily. He did not look at her like a regular girl anymore. He looked at her like a sharp tool that he could use to solve his problem. He told her there was a box of heavy account books beneath her feet, ordering her to pull them out immediately. He said he needed to know exactly how much money was tied up in those French warehouses before the carriage reached the city streets. Lily did not hesitate, bending down to drag the heavy leather box onto her lap and opening the brass locks to reveal the thick books inside. Lily opened the thick book, finding rows of neat numbers written in dark ink that made her feel instantly calm because numbers never lied. They did not care about her rough clothes, and they did not throw people out into the freezing rain. They were always exactly what they appeared to be. She ran her finger down the long columns, calling out the amounts of money over the loud noise of the carriage wheels. For the next 4 hours, the carriage felt like a busy office as they worked together to solve the financial problem. The white-haired man checked her numbers against his own notes, his pen moving quickly as they discussed taxes, shipping weight, and available cash. They did not talk about her lack of a hat or the fact that she was a ruined girl. They talked only about business and money. When the carriage finally hit the stone streets of Boston, causing a loud vibration through the floor, Lily closed the final book with a snap. She told him he stood to lose 12,000 pounds of expensive silk if he could not produce the money by tomorrow morning. The white-haired man leaned back against the seat cushions, looking exhausted, but keeping his intense eyes fixed directly on her face. He told her she had done a good job, which she knew was the highest praise he could give to anyone. She rested her hands on the leather book, feeling a sense of purpose that she had not felt since her father died. The carriage moved through the thick, smelly fog of the city streets, which were filled with the loud shouts of workers and the sound of iron wheels. Lily shrunk back into her corner, the massive size of the city, making her feel small and afraid after the quiet country life. The carriage turned into a narrow, dark alley lined with tall brick buildings, coming to a sudden stop before a small wooden door. The metal sign on the wall read Finch and Sons Maritime Law, and the white-haired man immediately opened the door to step out. He told her to stay inside the carriage, grabbing his leather folder before walking quickly through the fog and disappearing into the building. Lily sat alone in the dark cabin, listening to the horses breathe outside as the cold air began to come through the floorboards. 20 minutes passed, and she remembered his promise that she would no longer be his problem once they arrived in the city. She placed her hand on the cold metal handle of the door, thinking she should just get out and disappear into the foggy streets. Suddenly, the door of the law office flew open, and the white-haired man stepped out onto the stones, his face filled with a terrifying anger. A small, bald lawyer followed him out, shaking his hands in fear as the man shouted down the narrow alley. The white-haired man demanded a bank paper for the 400 francs immediately, but the lawyer cried that the bank was closed and the account required 2 signatures. The lawyer explained that his brother's name was required for any large amount of money, and since the brother was gone, his hands were tied by the law. The white-haired man stopped, his chest moving heavily as he realized he had beaten the storm but could not beat a simple bank rule. He knew his silk would be taken by the government, and there was nothing his money could do to stop it. In the carriage, Lily let go of the door handle and made a quick decision based on her own knowledge of the law. She pushed the door open, stepped down onto the wet stones, and marched straight past the white-haired man into the warm office. The small lawyer stared at her muddy boots and her rough brown dress, asking who this strange girl was. Lily ignored him, stepping up to the large wooden desk and turning the legal papers around so she could see them clearly. She told the lawyer he was using an old law meant for family money, pointing out that the shipping company was listed as a private business. The white-haired man entered the office, his dark eyes watching her closely as he told her to continue her explanation. Lily tapped the paper, explaining that under the business law, a main owner with 80% of the capital could sign an emergency paper, using his own house as collateral if the other partner was missing. The small lawyer stared at the papers, his face turning pale, as he admitted that her interpretation of the law was technically correct. The white-haired man ordered him to draw up the papers immediately and have a rider ready to take them to the ship within 10 minutes. The lawyer scrambled to his desk, and Lily stepped back, her body shaking as the excitement faded away. She realized she was standing in a nice office wearing a servant's dress, looking like a wild animal who had just shouted at a lawyer. She lowered her head, letting her hair hide her face, and walked back out into the cold fog of the alleyway alone. She did not get back into the carriage. She simply stood against the wet wood of the wheel, waiting for the end of her journey. 10 minutes later, a young worker ran out of the office, holding a sealed leather bag, sprinting down the foggy alley as fast as he could. The white-haired man walked out slowly, moving with a calm grace now that his business had been saved from ruin. He stopped on the stones, looked at Lily shivering against the carriage wheel, and told her the messenger had departed for the docks. Lily nodded without opening her eyes, her voice rough as she told him it was good that the problem was resolved. The man told her they were going to his house, but Lily opened her eyes and argued, saying their agreement was finished now that they were in the city. The white-haired man looked at her muddy dress, her tired eyes, and the stubborn pride that still showed in her face. He told her not to be stupid, catching her by the arm with a firm grip and pulling her away from the wheel toward the open door. He helped her up the step into the carriage, climbing in after her before knocking on the roof to tell the driver to move. The ride was very short, ending in a clean, quiet courtyard behind a massive stone townhouse in the best part of the city. He led her through a quiet back door, ignoring the surprised looks of his servants, and took her up the stairs into a large library. A huge fire was burning in the stone fireplace, making the room smell like old books, clean wood, and rich tobacco. It was the warmest and safest room Lily had ever seen, and she felt her body finally begin to relax. The white-haired man poured a glass of dark liquor from a glass bottle, walked over to her, and told her to sit down before she fainted. Lily sat in the large leather chair, drinking the strong liquid quickly to wash away the last of the cold from her chest. The man stood by the fire, looking down at the flames as he remarked that she did not learn about business law from a simple country estate. Lily told him her father had been a judge who taught her to read his papers because he believed a smart woman with knowledge of the law was a powerful weapon. The white-haired man turned to face her, admitting that his brother was an idiot and his current secretary was completely useless at his job. He walked closer, his pale face serious as he told her he was a man who liked order, hated polite society, and had a deep hatred for people who did not do their work well. He noted that she had no manners, lied poorly, but was incredibly smart and useful to his business. Lily gripped her glass tightly, her heart beating fast as she asked him what he was trying to say to her. She asked if he was offering her charity, insisting that she would never be dependent on his pity or live in his house like a beggar. The white-haired man looked at her, using her name for the very first time as he told her he did not possess a conscience or offer charity to anyone. He walked to his desk, pulled out a clean piece of paper, and began to write quickly with his silver pen. He told her he was offering her a formal contract to work as his private financial secretary with full access to all his business books. He said she would fix the problems his brother had made with the ships, live in a nice room on the second floor, and receive money to buy clean clothes. He finished writing, signed his name with a sharp line, and held the paper out toward her across the quiet space. Lily took the paper and read the simple paragraph, which promised her a salary of $300 a year, paid every 3 months. It was an incredible amount of money that meant she would be safe, independent, and free from her stepmother's cruelty forever. She looked up into his pale eyes, which were hard and intelligent, showing that he saw her as an equal partner rather than a victim. She told him she would require her own desk and would eat her meals in her room instead of with the servants, and the man agreed immediately. She added that if he ever spoke down to her, she would leave him to deal with his business problems alone, causing the white-haired man to let out another short laugh. He told her he had no doubt she would do exactly that, asking if they had an agreement to work together. Lily looked at the worn fire, then down at her old boots, knowing she had crawled through the mud and survived the storm on her own strength. She looked back at the white-haired king, telling him they had a deal. And as he poured another drink, the heavy tension between them turned into something strong and permanent. Lily looked out the high glass windows of the library, watching the gray morning fog slowly lift from the stone streets of the city below. The fire behind her crackled softly, throwing a warm golden light across the large mahogany desk that was now covered in her own neat stacks of business papers. Her hands, though still showing the small pink scars from her fall on the gravel road, no longer shook when she held her silk pen to write. She felt a deep sense of quiet peace settle into her mind as she thought about the strange path that had brought her to this warm room. She had entered this house as a freezing, ruined girl with nothing but her father's old boots, but she had carved out her own place through her own intelligence and hard work. She knew her future would not be like the stories in old books, filled with soft words and easy comfort, but would instead be a constant effort, alongside a very strange and powerful man. The white-haired man entered the room quietly, his dark eyes looking at the work she had completed before he took his own seat across from her, without a word. There was no need for empty talk between them, because they understood each other perfectly, two survivors who had found a way to stand together against the world. Lily knew that the ancient, cold nature of the man across from her would always remain a mystery, but she did not fear the dark anymore because she had learned to face it. Safety was not something given to her by a gentle savior. It was a reality she had earned for herself through her own choice to fight. As she dipped her pen into the ink to begin the day's accounting, she looked forward to the long years ahead with a calm and steady heart, ready for whatever the future might bring.